Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Daily Bolt with your host, Dr. Jeff Tilley. Today's topic, the WMO Climate Report for 2018, Part 3. Sit back and relax and enjoy today's Daily Bolt. So, it's been a bit longer than I had hoped to follow up on this series. I apologize for that. It's been kind of a couple of weeks full of lots of unexpected stuff, and unfortunately the podcast, since it's not monetized or anything yet, tends to get pushed down in favor of things that are monetized. Nonetheless, we move forward and we pick up where we left off with the WMO report related to the state of the climate. This is going to be a relatively short podcast. I have a few topics. I'm going to put them in separate podcasts over the next few days. But there's a few things about the WMO report that I do want to comment on. One of the things that I had mentioned in a previous podcast was the fact that it seemed a little odd that as climate indicators, a term that the WMO uses for things that they consider significant to keep an eye on and continue to monitor, was the variable ocean heat content, not just for the upper 700 meters, but the upper 2,000 meters. And I said I was going to go back, look through the report on that, report on a few other things in terms of some of the details of the report, and so that's the purpose for today's podcast. I found nothing in the report that specifically talks about why it's the upper 700 meters. Certainly, this depth contains the surface layer. That tends to be relatively well mixed. It contains the thermocline, and it contains a significant amount of the ocean beneath the thermocline. It's not really considered deep ocean. It's kind of intermediate ocean water. The best explanation I can come up with, given that they choose not to discuss the choice of this indicator, and there's also some glaring omissions for what's supposed to be a public report of some other indicators and diagnostics that they nonetheless put images out and try and use to tell a specific narrative. But the reason for the 700 meter, I believe that gives us, for much of the ocean, down into what we call the intermediate depth ocean water, which is part of what we call the global thermohaline circulation. The thermohaline circulation is an extremely important circulation to keep an eye on in terms of the climate system, because it governs effectively ocean transports worldwide over long time scales. We're talking on the scale of a decade or multiple decades. And it's a large-scale circulation where there is effectively a large global overturning of the ocean water. And part of the importance of the intermediate depth layer is that there are several parts of the circulation that occur predominantly into that depth layer, particularly if you're looking into the southern hemisphere. One of the things that was noted on the 2018 WMO climate report is that south of the main currents of the Southern Ocean, that's a circumpolar current that basically runs around the globe in a more or less west to east direction. There was actually not significant warming, but even a little bit of potential cooling in the ocean water temperatures. And there are folks out there that would say, look, all the ocean isn't warming. There's cooling going on here. This is a natural place for cooling to occur, however. There is one of the branches of the global thermohaline circulation leading up from the Southern Ocean areas bordering Antarctica into lower latitudes, closer into the subtropics and the tropics, where it descends into intermediate depths. And there has been significant warming there. So what's going on there? Most likely, there is some upwelling, which is a phenomenon we've talked about before in other contexts, where cooler water from deep levels in the ocean basically is forced to rise to the surface because of the motion of a circulation pulling water away from somewhere else at the surface. And nature doesn't like a vacuum. And so deeper water comes up from the areas closer to the ocean floor, which is colder. Meanwhile, the warmer water is transported farther to the north into the subtropics and the tropics, where it tends to descend into this intermediate depth layer, which goes down into the neighborhood of approximately 700 meters, although they could have chosen anything within a range probably of a kilometer up to about 500 meters and really included that. And one of the problems that they do have with these diagnostics is that they're actually looking at the entirety of the layers. Why is this a problem? This is a problem because it goes back to the recent discoveries of the underwater autonomous vehicle nicknamed Bodie McBoatface, which we talked about in a podcast a couple months ago. And we found that there are processes in terms of turbulence in some of these layers and in some of this upwelling region and in boundary currents that may or may not cause us to ultimately rethink the exact model of how this branch of the thermohaline circulation operates. And so there's questions now, okay, what is a good diagnostic for ocean heat content? Should we have more? Should we have one for just the surface mixed layer, which has some value in it because that is the layer that often gets tapped most directly by tropical cyclones, and supposedly warmer surface mixed layers would lead to more and stronger tropical cyclones, or weaker thermocline. So 700 meters, I wish they would have justified it better. I don't like it when I see reports that are put out for public consumption with lots of metrics in them, and there's no details. And the question is, are some of these details inconvenient? That's a good question. Let's go now to the other depth that was referred to in terms of these climate indicators. This is a 2,000 meter depth heat content. Presumably, that's going down into the deep water. And this justification is given. It's coming supposedly from a series of what are called attribution studies that try to link one process in the climate system with another. And these are all the rage now, and perhaps far too much so. And that's going to be a subject of the next podcast, in that you run a numerical model. You try to put as much data in as you can. We've talked about before that there's definitely big data gaps, and there are assumptions that are made into the input that goes into these numerical models that is based on specific assumptions for spatial structures in the horizontal, in the vertical, in intensity, etc., and they're based on what we know. But as Bodie McBoatface tells us, we certainly don't know everything. Should some of these all be changed? This has become a big area for rapid research, and not always by the most qualified people doing these attribution studies, because they can be done relatively simply once you have them set up. And the trouble is, they often are very biased by the assumptions that go into them in the first place. So if you want to find a link between greenhouse gases and deep ocean heat content, there's probably pieces in the assumptions that you're using that will make that attribution easier. I've looked at one of the articles in terms of the abstracts that form these attribution studies, and there are some things that are in there that are, in my opinion, just totally wrong. There are attributions of increases in the westerly jet that are tied, for example, to things that are not direct functions. They're very indirect effects. And you have people throwing around statements, oh, well, greenhouse gases cause this increase in the westerlies directly. It's like, no, it can't do that. They cannot do that. And that brings rise to all sorts of things where people see this stuff on the internet. they don't understand the context. They don't understand how to properly interpret the results and even see that some of this is wrong. And a lot of it has also not been through a peer review process. It just gets thrown up on the internet because these people can. Lots of red flags in those types of things. And if you're using an attribution study or series of studies as the basis for the climate indicators that you're using, you better be very, very, very sure that these attribution studies are pretty much ironclad bulletproof. And I don't believe the WMO has done that. I believe they've took the first couple that looked somewhat good. I would like to say that I've been able to look at all of those, but some of these are published only in scientific journals that are fantastically expensive to look at, where they charge you $70 to get one article. Guess what? I'm not going to pay that. I don't think lots of other people will pay that. And so the information is controlled and it's accessed by a relatively small group of people. People in large research institutes, people in large universities that even have a subscription to this journal. Many universities and research institutions do not subscribe to every possible journal that's out there because there just isn't enough money to do that. It's a big kind of publishing racket, and it's sad. I'd love to see more of this stuff get published and peer-reviewed on websites that are effectively open access. Open access journals are a big piece of modern science research. And as more and more things get published, where more and more people can't access it without putting out a ridiculous amount of money, that's very dangerous. What assumptions are going in there? How much is related to the fact that in some cases, some of these people have to find a certain result if they want to keep their job? Let's give a hypothetical example of that. Let's say I worked in a research institute where I was expected to justify it being a climate research institute and that we would be coming up with rapid influential results. That was the way that the agency had given the money to the research institute. That was the justification. Well, you find a result that doesn't back that up, and guess what? The money goes away. I've had instances in my own career where things like this have happened, and I have chosen not to follow the money. I've chosen to follow my integrity and the truth of the science. Not everybody is so altruistic, unfortunately. So there's things there. There's some other pieces in the WMO report that also make me nervous. I'd like to see more of the direct results that some of this stuff is being touted from and based upon, and see the justification so it can get more peer review. But the UN, in helping to sponsor the WMO reports, is, insisting, these have to come out every year. You have this much time, blah, 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 blah. And that doesn't often allow for nearly as much of what I'd like to see in terms of the details of some of these reports. So I'm not totally sold on the WMO report. The pretty pictures they put out have some general information, which I think is useful. And there's going to be some follow-up that I'm going to tie back to the WMO report in the next couple of podcasts that deal with the increasing hysteria that's in the reporting, the increasing misattribution and misunderstanding and misquoting and misinformation that is going out there and being digested by way too many people who are being told more or less what they want to hear. It's a scary situation. It's sad for what it's doing to the scientific community, which often is being taken out of context and not entering the fray itself. Maybe we need to have more people like me doing this podcast entering the fray. Who knows? Well, 14 minutes and 30 seconds, and I said this was going to be a short podcast, and it has turned out to be a long podcast. We'll see what happens with the next ones coming up. So, for this edition of the Daily Bolt, I'm Dr. Jeff Tilley. Thanks for listening. Good night, good morning, good afternoon, and God bless.